So as consumers, we are shaped both by our cultures and our biological heritage. So let's start with a cultural example. If we look at different cuisines, they vary in the amount of spices that they use. So for example, the birria spicy Mexican soup is very different from, say, the Swedish meatball plate. The question, though, is why are some cuisines more spicy than others? And for this, we turn to evolutionary psychology. It turns out that cultures that use more spices are cultures that are in hotter climates. Hotter climates have more food pathogens, and therefore the use of spices is a cultural adaptation to a very important biological problem. So culture doesn't exist somehow outside of our biology. Let me give you another example from the food context. The variety effect is something that we all succumb to. Some of us succumb to it a lot more than others. This is where you can't stop eating, say, at a buffet because you want to sample all different foods. Well, it turns out that the variety effect manifests itself even in cases where it shouldn't. So for example, if you look at the M&Ms, the candies, if I give you one-colored M&Ms or multicolored M&Ms, they don't taste differently because the food colorant is tasteless, it's odorless, yet people will eat a lot more from the bowl that has the multicolored candies. Same idea with the singular-shaped pasta versus the uni-shaped pasta. The pasta tastes exactly the same, but I'll eat a lot more from the multi-shaped pasta. Moving on from food to the most important topic of all, sex, I argue in my work that a lot of the products that we use them because they serve as sexual signals in the mating market. So let me give you a few examples. I'll give some examples from both men and women. So I did a study a few years ago with one of my graduate students where we studied peacocking. Specifically, what happens to men's testosterone levels when they drive a fancy Porsche or a beaten-up old car in one of two environments, downtown Montreal, where everybody could see you, or on a semi-deserted highway. And each driving condition, we collected salivary assays to measure their testosterone levels. And of course, as most people in this room can predict, you put a young male in a Porsche, his endocrinological system explodes. And it explodes because you are imbuing him with an immediate social win. We know from other animals, species, the winner of a fight has a testosterone rise, the loser has a drop in its testosterone. That's exactly what's happening with this type of peacocking. Continuing with another example, this is a study done by some British psychologists. So they took a guy and a girl, they put them either in a beaten-up old Ford Fiesta or in a very fancy Bentley, and they brought in participants and had men rate the girl and women rate the guy. Now, men didn't care which car the girl was in when judging how attractive she is. Women, on the other hand, judged the exact same guy as very unattractive or Brad Pitt gorgeous, depending on whether he was in one car or the other. Now, this study, you could do it in Mexico or in Nigeria or in Japan. You'll get the exact same finding because that speaks to a universal reality. Continuing, this is a study that I did, it's not turning, a study that I did with one of my graduate students. It's an ongoing study. We created 2 online dating profiles, exact same dating profiles. The only thing that's different is the guy's favorite possession. We either show him as owning a very beautiful, fancy red Porsche or a not-so-beautiful red, cheap Kia. No disrespect to anybody who owns Kias. And we simply asked people, well, what do you think of this guy? For the purposes of this talk, I'd like to talk about height. How did people perceive his height as a function of whether he was associated with the Porsche? Now, here's the really interesting part. Men shortened him, right? Because high-status male is a intrasexual rival to me, and so I want to insult him, I want to denigrate him. Oh, he must be a short guy if he owns a Porsche. On the other hand, what do you think happened with women? They elongated him. Wow, what a tall, beautiful man. So the exact same reality is perceptually viewed completely differently depending on whether I'm a man or a woman. I'm trying to convince my wife that I should buy a Porsche so that I can gain a few inches. Here's a study done a few decades ago, but there's a real evolutionary story that could be told. So these researchers did a field experiment where they blocked the intersection, either with a fancy car or a less fancy car. These weren't the actual cars that they used, but I just chose them for the purposes of this talk. And then they wanted to see how long it would take an actual person that was behind the blocking car to honk as a function of whether they were being blocked by a high-status car or a low-status car. And what do you think happened? People are a lot more patient when the car in front of me is an Aston Martin. To finish this story, some German psychologists took the same car as the blocking car, Volkswagen Jetta, and then they wanted to now see whether the status of the car of the person that was being blocked would affect his or her behavior. And again, we get the same phenomenon. If I am driving a fancy car, I'm a lot less patient. I exhibit a lot more dominance. And this is something that you see in many species in terms of dominance and deference. In this case, we're showing it in the context of an everyday behavior, such as driving. Now, of course, it's not only men who engage in sexual signaling. Women do it too. Of course, they use different products to do it. So with one of my other doctoral students, I did a study a few years ago where we looked at what happens to women's behaviors as a function of where they are in the menstrual cycle. And specifically, for the purposes of this talk, we looked at their beautification practices. Do they wear makeup? Do they dress sexily? Do they wear high heels? Do they suntan? So do they beautify themselves as a function of where they are in the menstrual cycle? And the answer turns out to be absolutely. When they are ovulating, when they are in the maximally fertile phase of their cycle, this is when they advertise themselves the most. And this is exactly what you see with other species. So for example, here I have a photo of a female chimp that has engorged genitalia because she's actually signaling to the males that she is certainly receptive to advances. So human females do it, but they maybe do it in a slightly more subtle way. Now, if you really want to study women's psychology, study products that are targeted to women. And it turns out that romance novels, whether you're a Mexican consumer or a Nigerian consumer or a Japanese consumer, are almost always consumed or read by women. Now, here's the interesting part. The male hero in those romance novels is the exact same guy always. He is a tall prince who's a neurosurgeon. He wrestles alligators on his six-pack. He's reckless, but he could only be tamed by the love of this one good woman. And that speaks to women's evolved fantasies. There is no romance novel where the male archetype is the guy at the bottom from Revenge of the Nerds. That's not because marketers are promulgating sexist stereotypes. It's because marketers, if they are good marketers, understand human nature and therefore create products that cater to our human nature. Now, if you find your ideal mate and you go out and get a baby, I don't know why it's not coming out. Yeah, there you go. Here's a very interesting study done. Bear with me. We'll come to consumer behavior in a second. This was a study, coincidentally, that was done in the Yucatan here in Mexico many years ago in a city called Tikul, where they studied when a baby is born, who is he said to look like? And here's the very evolutionary story. Everybody says that he looks like the father, and especially the mother's side of the family. And the reason for, now objectively, there's no way that the baby looks like anyone at that point. But what you're doing there is you are trying to convince the father that don't worry, your wife didn't cheat on you. It is your baby. Everything is evolution, people. By the way, if you're wondering why those two kids at the bottom here are extremely good looking, that's because they're my children. Now, this is something that happened to me. This is actually the images, the ultrasound images of my wife when she was carrying our first daughter, Luna. Now, if you look at this image, you can't tell if this is an extraterrestrial, if it's an amoeba, if it's a virus. Yet my mother-in-law saw this image on the fridge, stopped and said, "Oh my God, Gad, the baby looks exactly like you." That's evolution, people. Now, how do we link this to consumer behavior? Well, you can. So I'm doing a study with some Israeli colleagues where we're looking at wedding gifts at Israeli weddings. By the way, this is a photo of my parents when they got married in 1950. And so we wanted to look at whether the size of the gift, the size of the monetary gift, would depend on whether it is the maternal side or the paternal side of the bride and groom. And if we buy into the story of paternity uncertainty, which I discussed in the previous slides, you should expect that the maternal side of both the bride and groom give much larger gifts than the paternal side, and that's exactly what we found in our study. You could have never come up with this finding. You could have never posited that hypothesis where you're not aware of these issues of genetic relatedness. And so this demonstrates, again, the importance of evolutionary psychology in studying human affairs. So what's the point of all this? What can we conclude? Well, we can conclude that successful international marketers are those who recognize that the global consumer is shaped both by environmental as well as biological forces. For too long, the social sciences have rejected the importance of biology. And the reality is, we're both a biological and cultural animal. If we want to understand consumer behavior, we have to understand our consuming instinct. Thank you very much.